Good afternoon, Friday, Melbourne, the 25th of September. Speaking to you from the largest unauthorized, unlawful prison in the world. Now, I'm just going to pop you on to Alan Jones, and thank God for Alan Jones on Sky News. You must get onto this program. It's on nearly every night of the week. The only man who actually comes out and speaks the truth, and it's so refreshing. It just has to be shared. I really do. And sadly, a lot of people don't get to see Sky News, but we need to direct them in that direction, and we need to share what you're about to see now is really remarkable. And another piece of this at the end that has not been shown on live on YouTube, or sorry, it's not on YouTube anywhere. I can't find it. So lucky enough, I did record the program, and of this lady at the end, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. She really explains the system. Catherine McGregor, an Air Force officer, brilliant. And she actually mentions common law and common sense, I suppose, and the Constitution, something which the Labour Party, Whitlam, Hawke removed and destroyed. Now they do use the word persons, which is fiction, and of course they use legal, which is fiction as well. But they got the message across, and I tell you what, I really appreciate it, and I hope you do.
Away from all this other nonsense, there are issues at the centre of this coronavirus response which can't be ignored. The two most prominent are, in the first instance, the expectation from governments that we will or should surrender to each and every of their totalitarian dictates. For months now, we've been ordered to do X and Y with not one syllable of evidence to validate the orders. And this betrays every known precept of what is just, which dates back centuries. The principle of habeas corpus, we learnt that at school, means if you're going to detain someone, you have to provide to a court a valid reason for that person's detention. Habeas corpus, you must produce the body. For months, we've been given no valid reasons as to why we can't leave our home, even now, why we can't go to a bar and we can't stand up, why we can go to a wedding but only the bride and groom are allowed on the dance floor, why you can go to the beach in summer but preferably not at midday, and you have to be at least the length of a towel away from the next person. And if not, presumably, you'll be arrested. Under habeas corpus, what is the valid reason for these dictatorial edicts? Which brings us to the second point, and that is the total denial of freedom inherent in all of this. I, for one, Alan Jones, am not prepared to accept that because Daniel Andrews says so, or Gladys Berejiklian, or Anastasia Palaszczuk, or even Scott Morrison, just because they order us, does that mean they are right? Where is the evidence? I've called for a national advertising campaign to enable us to be told the truth. Why has not one politician ever told the nation that 99% of cases are mild? Why have these freedoms been stolen from us now? But they weren't during a world war. Here we are in peacetime, being denied the very values that people went to war to protect. Are we going to let these dictators get away with this? That's what Donald Trump was on about last week when he talked about toxic propaganda and ideological poison that, quote, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds which tie us together, unquote. Well, everything in the last months been about keeping us apart. Donald Trump spoke again, quote, scaring you out of speaking the truth and bullying Americans into abandoning their values, their heritage and their very way of life, unquote. Which prompts the question, I suppose, what are we going to do about it? Surely we're not just going to sit back and cop all this. If so, for how long? I'll tell you how far we've sunk. We spoke to a doctor in the last 24 hours who told this program about the lockdowns, the children, the young adults, the new mothers whom, quote, she said, I mainly treat who are in anguish, despair and have no hope. In a letter to the Premier of Victoria, she wrote, the purpose of this letter is to plead with you to look at what we can reopen safely. She went on, as I've argued from the outset, quote, we still protect the vulnerable and the elderly while continuing important public health measures. But she says in the letter, quote, now should be a time to work to reduce the unhealthy social isolation that's contributed to other adverse health outcomes. She wrote, quote, I see approximately 180 to 200 patients per week, and it's disturbing what the effect of lockdown is causing. Now remember, no less a person than the Nobel Prize winner, Professor Michael Levitt, says lockdowns are a, quote, huge mistake. But writes the doctor, I'm doing 15 to 20 mental health care consultations daily, in comparison to 3 to 5 this time last year. I have many 12 to 15-year-olds so depressed, some suicidal. I've no other option but to put them on antidepressants. As this lockdown, she says, moves into months, not weeks, access to psychiatrists and psychologists is now almost impossible, and or the wait is too long. She says, seeing children as young as 12 years describe their darkest thoughts, some suicidal, is very disturbing. They cry about how much they're missing school and their friends. She said, I'm doing many telehealth phone calls to distressed mothers, alone, with their newborns crying out for help. Postnatal depression is a huge concern, unquote. Now, you will recall I have warned of the consequences of alarmism and fear being preached with every sentence uttered by these so-called leaders. I would argue, not a leader's bootlace. This young doctor has written to me about, quote, people not coming into the clinic to have their routine checks, blood tests and immunisations. Patients, she said, are afraid to leave their house, even to seek vital medical care. She said, we're not diagnosing other important health conditions like cancer and heart disease, which take many Australian lives every year. She writes, Premier Andrews, please consider revising the current Victorian roadmap. Children need to return to school. New mothers need social connectivity, as does the whole community. She said there are many industries which have been shown not to contribute to the spread of COVID-19, which should reopen. Financial strain, she said, is contributing to this mental health crisis. Now, I've warned that this is the end result of yielding to dictatorial edicts and accepting the denial of our freedoms. This doctor quotes the World Health Organization, which states that, quote, a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being is not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. She ends by saying simply, harsh lockdowns like here in Victoria are doing more harm than good. We have a huge health crisis on our hands, which is much more than COVID-19. Well, the further tragedy I regret to add is that another crisis has overtaken society, which I've alluded. That same doctor was to come on the program tonight. She'd agreed to be here. She listened to my program last night. She declined tonight because she heard me last night supporting Donald Trump. This is the point we've reached on this critical issue of freedom. The fight back must begin unless we are to become a nation of robots. Do as you're told. Be careful what you say. Don't prosper debate or discussion. Silence both. I've said all along this coronavirus response is out of all proportion to the problem. I'm happy to give credit and say that our so-called leaders were well-intentioned, but they have no mandate for what they're doing to this country now. They've gone too far down the road of I know best. Turn around, come back, give this country back to the people. Return our freedoms, leave the lecturing and the propaganda and the indoctrination to those in our universities whom you, politicians, steadfastly refuse to pull into line, but leave us alone. We've had enough. Look, do you sometimes wake up and think to yourself, am I going nuts? All we seem to get in relation to this wretched coronavirus is negativism, alarmism and fear. There are very few syllables of hope and happiness. I see polls today which tell us that 62% of voters agree that Daniel Andrews has handled the pandemic well. Queenslanders have backed Anastasia Palaszczuk. 68% say she's doing well. Voters say Scott Morrison has handled the pandemic well. And you might wonder how we get these figures. Well, it's easy. You see, from the outset, the prevailing mood generated by politicians was alarmism. Remember how there would not be enough intensive care beds. 150,000 people were going to die. And this was fed to us in press conferences every night. So if the argument being ventilated is death is around the corner unless you do as Big Brother politician tells you, then when you wake up in the morning, you think, oh, God, I'm alive. I've got Daniel Andrews to thank for that. He tells me this thing kills you and I'm alive. It's rubbish, of course, but these politicians have thrived on fear. And that's why never once have they said 99% of all cases are mild. They won't tell us that today there are only 8 cases in Australia which are serious. They won't tell us that. I've said we need a national advertising campaign to tell us the facts and tell us the truth. We won't get that either. Governments won't do it. It'll expose them. Government won't tell us that in 3 sets of testing data compiled by officials in Massachusetts, New York and Nevada, 90% of people testing positive carried barely any virus. You see, we've been down this track before in relation to alarmism on a million fronts. I remember when this Dr. Paul Ehrlich was an international hero, like the Flannerys of this world, a Stanford University biologist. Oh, they're wonderful, these scientists, who said in 1967, I quote, "The time of famine is upon us, and it'll be at its worst and most disastrous by 1975. He was internationally acclaimed. This is like telling us we'll run out of intensive care beds. 150,000 people will die. And this is like the Spanish flu. Fill people with alarmism and fear, and then they must be grateful when they manage to live. Fortunately, I've been around long enough to hear all this alarmist nonsense before. Do you remember Y2K? The Commonwealth Bank was testing over 61,000 systems. Over 1,500 were date sensitive. So by the year 2000, of course, they'd fail, wouldn't they? Critical sites, kaput. They'd all be buggered. The government even instituted a Y2K industry program, and we were told that call centres, operation centres and administrative buildings would cark it. The Commonwealth Bank had a Millennium Program Director. Do you remember what happened to Y2K and the Y2K bug? Why are we not told, as I read from the Federal Department of Health, 15th of September 2020, it's a week ago today, a heading, Australian Government Department of Health Therapeutic Goods Administration. Quote, the reliability of COVID-19 tests is uncertain due to the limited evidence base. I repeat, the reliability of COVID-19 tests is uncertain due to the limited evidence base. That's the Australian Government's Department of Health 1 week ago. And it further says, quote, there is limited evidence available to assess the accuracy and clinical utility of available COVID-19 tests. Does anyone tell you that? If not, why not? So what's it mean? Donald Trump spoke at this Davos World Forum earlier this year and got it right in refreshing simplicity. He said, quote, we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse. They want to see us do badly. The alarmists, he said, have been wrong on previous occasions, predicting a population crisis, mass starvation and the end of oil. Well, where are the modelers and the scientists now and the prophets of doom? I'll tell you where they are. They're still at it. Now we're told we're entering a summer, which is going to be a nightmare. If you go to the beach, you'll have to stay a towel's length from the next person. You'll be able to go to the pub and drink with your mates, but only if you're sitting down. Your freedoms count for nothing. They're going to put a stop to the Aussie tradition of crowds at the beaches, and you'll be told by government to not hang around for too long and avoid the middle of the day. Where is the evidence to justify this? God knows what they'll do if you ignore them. And then this, we're told, is a year-long program. Year-long. You see, these politicians have got the power and they're going to hang on to it. And they've frightened you sufficiently so that presumably we believe, aren't they good people? They've saved our lives. Well, count me out of that crowd, I can tell you. We know how to look after our own health. We don't need some politician who in the real world would struggle to be appointed deputy principal of a primary school. We don't need them telling us how to safeguard our own well-being. They keep talking about cases. They never tell us that 99% are mild and well over 99% recover. They just want to whip us up into a lather of fear. Oh, the Sydney fireworks will go ahead, by the way, but most people will watch them from home, so we're told. And for weddings, no dancing, no mingling, no singing, no more than 150 guests, and only the bride and groom are allowed on the dance floor. So we're going to have wedding police, I suppose. And if you go to the movies, well, you'll have to sit 1.5 metres apart. Screenings will be staggered to allow staff to disinfect the facility. Where is the evidence that tells us these things must happen, that these things assist people's health? Christmas Day? Oh, you can only have 20 guests at home. So there'll be Christmas Day police, I suppose. And there's a daily limit on visitors, so long as there are no more than 20 at a time at Christmas. Who makes these rules? And the politicians are loving it. They've never been so powerful. They want to rule our lives. Yes, 968,000 people have died, so we're told. Have they died from coronavirus or with it? This is in the world. In Australia since February, 854 deaths. But 450 people die every day in Australia. 8 people are seriously ill. 8. You know what I mean when I say sometimes I wake up and think either I'm going nuts or the joint is going nuts. And these plans we're now told today are a year long. When will it end? Is this another Y2K job being done on us? Happiness out the window? Fear and alarmism are the uninvited guests, seemingly forever. Thank God for Donald Trump. How close was he to the truth when he branded those warning of out-of-control global warming and other environmental disasters? He said, the heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers, the alarmists, have been wrong on previous occasions. He's dead right about that. But why will no one tell us what the Australian Government's Department of Health has issued in its regular update a week ago, September 15, I quote again, the reliability of COVID-19 tests is uncertain due to the limited evidence base. I think we're entitled to wake up in the morning thinking that the world's gone mad. Perhaps the final say should go to the Victorian strongman Daniel Andrews. This is what he said, quote, all of this can be avoided if people don't protest, because protest is not only selfish, it's stupid. Or what about this one? You would be surprised by how much would be avoided if people stop insisting on their personal freedoms, because insisting on human rights is not only selfish, it's stupid. Perhaps that prompts you to wonder why you even bother waking up. Oh, just a final thought. May I even be arrested for daring to say? Well, let's go to Catherine McGregor, where I have to say every week illuminates our life. Good evening to you, Catherine. And can I just begin with a reference to that beautiful piece of a couple of weeks ago where in magnificent language you wrote, the past 2 decades have seemed an eternity. Spring 2000 seems but a distant dream. Let us hope we can awake from this nightmare soon. Catherine, can I ask you this? The nightmare. I mean, how could any politician anywhere in the civilised world seek, as Andrews has done in Victoria, to legislate to lock up anyone so long as they have, quote, a reasonable suspicion such person may be likely to refuse or fail quarantine rules? So habeas corpus goes out the window, locking someone up on reasonable suspicion by designated authorised officers chosen by a public servant, and the legislation would have given power to remove children from their parents for a longer cumulative period than would otherwise be permitted under current legislation. Is this the nightmare we're in, Catherine?
Absolutely preposterous draft legislation, Alan. When I first saw Robert Gottliebsen's piece on the weekend about this, I could not credit that it was true. But on further investigation, it was every bit as bad as Robert indicated. And you then had a very eminent group of senior counsel, and the preeminent of them was former High Court Justice Michael McHugh, an outstanding jurist. And I might add, not a judicial activist who was ever one. He was very slow to imply guaranteed human rights or implicit freedoms into the text and structure of the Constitution, but he drew the line at this. That should have been a very salutary warning for many lawyers, and today the National Bar Association and Council and also that of Victoria denounced this, and it's about time. Where is this enormous human rights apparatus that gears up out of Victoria over Manus Island? You know, the people who are all wanting to run around with their hair on fire over David Hicks and Habib being held in warrantless and executive detention. You know, it's absolutely preposterous. And I draw your attention to another little piece of hypocrisy. Andrews is off the leash. He's got a long term to run, and there is no effective separation of powers at the state government level. There is, at least in the text and structure of the Commonwealth Constitution, some judicial review of the legislature, and the Commonwealth's powers are enumerated and prescribed. State governments have enormous plenary power. However, this character, I think, is following the lunacy of his Twitter army and is being buoyed by these polls that show the enormous, unquestioning, almost fealty towards him. And he's now taken on an almost, you know, it's no coincidence, frankly, that these concepts of habeas corpus and these hard-won rights that we've taken for granted arose out of the great constitutional settlement against the monarchy. And this stuff is really worthy of a monarch. Absolutely. The way he's behaving.
Well, let me take
executive fiat.
Let me take another point here. Protesters. I mean, there are now questions being raised about the arrest of Victorian freedom protesters in recent weeks as to whether that is constitutionally illegal. The argument that these are really our first political prisoners. These are people deprived of their liberty solely because of their non-violent freedom to peaceful assembly. But no one arrested over Black Lives Matter.
Well, there's a double standard at work, most certainly, and the reference, the police down there are highly politicised as well. They're much better at policing pronouns than real offenders, but they did make that remark about tinfoil hat brigade, referring to anti-vaxxers and others. And whether you agree with the people on principle or not, that reprehensible, grotesque image of the woman being arrested in front of her children, the pregnant woman, and Stuart Wood QC, to his great credit, stepped up to assist her, as he did in the Israel Folau case. It's very, very alarming, and there are certainly double standards. But I come back to the fact, Australians would be shocked at how vast the plenary power of these state governments is. There is no effective separation of state power, separation of powers at the state level. Sadly, there are certain received fundamental common law rights, one of which is habeas corpus, to which you alluded, and that should mean that no person is incarcerated without a judicial oversight of the warrant. Yeah. And we're reaching the point now where that line could easily be crossed at the way this bloke's behaving.
But I mean, here are people, Catherine, who are just peacefully protesting because they can't abide the carpet bombing of the economy. I mean, this makes Victoria a human rights pariah. But Canberra are silent in all of this. Catherine, where on earth are Canberra?
Well, the two things are astonishing. One is that the ADF, around which there's been controversy about who knew they were available and who didn't and so on, and there's a rolling catastrophe of the quarantine breakdown. But certainly the federal government should have made very clear that if Andrews proceeded with this grotesque piece of legislation, that certainly no Commonwealth officers or officers of the Commonwealth, in particular, uniformed members of the ADF, would be used in this coercive manner on such dubious grounds. It is repugnant. It runs contrary to every spirit and text of our system, and this shouldn't stand. But as you point out, Alan, this is the home of the human rights industry, Victoria, and they have been breathtakingly silent on this. They can get exercised about detention on Manus, but their entire citizenry are effectively now under curfew. You go back to Blackstone's commentaries on the great settlement of 1689 and made it clear that going back to the great English jurist Cook, who took on the Stuart kings, no person may be detained without warrant sworn under a magistrate. Now, I'll come to just one other bit of hypocrisy. Last month, there was a dissenting report released by the Labor and Greens members of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights in Canberra. Federal parliamentarians of this bloke's own party and persuasion drew the line at warrantless detention by ASIO of terrorism suspects and said, without a warrant, under a judicial process, this is a terrible breach, a terrible infringement. Has one member of that committee called Andrews to account?
Absolutely.
This matter, the Federal Labor Party has to step in on this bloke, not the Commonwealth Government, because he treats them with absolute disdain, and you've got to question the ticker, frankly, of the federal government for not clamping down on Section 92 earlier and so on. But where are his federal colleagues based in Melbourne, Dreyfus the QC, and other people who are on that committee who put out a dissenting report, got all tizzy about ASIO being able to detain people without judicial warrant, saying that the Attorney General and Director General of ASIO couldn't be trusted. I agree with that, by the way. This has always been part of the judicial oversight of executive detention and warrants.
That's it.
And the lettre de cachet, as it is known, which is an executive order for detention, has no place in the common law. No. Our highest court has said that. And we really need to draw a line on this.
I agree. Catherine, it's amazing. Look, I don't understand. On all of these things that matter from a national perspective, our national government is silent. They don't want to buy into a fight. They don't want to get into the ring. Wonderful to talk to you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your scholarship. And the public out there love you. Rest assured of that, and I'll see you next week. There she is, Catherine McGregor.
Great to talk to you.
We'll be back after the break.
Well, that was refreshing. The truth, the painful truth. Thanks for watching London News. I hope to be live on Saturday at 3 o'clock. My first attempt at being live. I don't know what to expect. Looking forward to seeing you there on Saturday at 3 o'clock, the 6th. God, you see, when you're old at 75, it's pretty hard to keep up. But never mind, I'm doing my best. Thanks for watching. Bye for now, and subscribe. And don't forget to get your ID card. Have a look on the last video. It tells you all about it. Bye, guys. Thanks.